Hey, what's up, Spice Heads? Welcome back to another great video meetup. Today, sponsored by Dimension Data, we're going to be talking all about Office 365, and not just the stories that you hear about from marketing material, but what it's like when you actually deploy Office 365 in the real world. And so for more on this, we've got a great panel of experts for y'all, including an IT pro from the Spiceworks community, as well as a couple of experts from Dimension Data. So without further ado, let's go ahead and start things off with a round of introductions so you guys can meet our panel of experts. Batting first, representing Spiceworks Community, everyone please welcome Mr. Brad Wallach. Brad, how's it going today?
Good. Good to be here.
Thanks for joining us today, Brad. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do?
Yeah, I'm an IT administrator for a Midwest bank. It's a team of 3 guys out here in the northeast, southeast parts of Nebraska. We've got 10 branches across the side of the state, so we just work in the community banking industry, small communities mostly.
All right, very cool. And where are you based out of, Brad?
Nebraska. We're based out of Pierce, Nebraska.
Okay, very cool. Well, thanks for joining us today, Brad. Looking forward to hearing from you. Our next panelist comes to us from Dimension Data. Everyone please welcome Mr. Dave Slater. Dave, how's it going today?
Hey, excellent, Justin. Excited to be on here.
Sweet. Dave, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do for Dimension Data?
Yeah, sure. So Director of Strategic Alliances with Dimension Data's Microsoft Productivity Center of Excellence.
Okay, very cool. And Dave, where are you based out of? Where are you calling us today from?
Toronto, Canada.
Toronto, Canada. Are you guys covered in snow yet, or is that still to come?
No, actually, a balmy 18 degrees today, which is probably in the mid-60s for you guys.
All right. Well, thanks for joining us today, Dave. And last but not least, and we're really hoping his audio works, is Mr. Phil Aldrich. Phil, how's it going today?
Good. I'm doing great, and I'm Phil Aldrich. I'm the Director of End User Computing for North America for Dimension Data, and all of the Microsoft and Office 365 work comes out of my business. And I've been with Dimension Data for about 17 years.
Very cool, Phil. You sound great. We're excited about that. Where are you calling us today from?
I'm calling from Atlanta, and it's chillier than in Atlanta than it is in Toronto for some reason.
Very cool.
Yep.
Well, we probably won't last long, but we'll see how it goes. Well, guys, before we go any further, there are a few housekeeping items I did want to cover. On your console, you should see all of our faces, and there's a few other widgets that I did want to point out as well. On the bottom of your console, there is a navy blue widget that does allow you to chat with the other attendees. I see some of you guys have already discovered that widget. Make sure to pop it open and say hi. I've got Emily D, my partner in crime here. She'll be saying hi to you guys as well. But most importantly, there is a purple Q&A widget where you'll be able to shoot us questions directly. We're going to be taking all of your questions, or as many as we can get to, live today on the show, so make sure to get those questions in through that purple Q&A widget. Lastly, there's also a green widget where Dimension Data has provided some great resources for you guys to check out. Last but not least is, as a special thank you for hanging out with us today on this Thursday afternoon, one of you guys is going to be walking away with an Arctic 45 cooler. So perfect time for winter, I guess, because you need those cold drinks in winter. But we'll be announcing the winner of that cooler at the end of the show. So make sure to stick around for that. Well, we'll go ahead and get started. I wanted to hear from Brad first. So Brad, you guys just got done with an Office 365 deployment. Can you talk us through us real quickly what that experience was like for you? What parts, what elements, what applications did you guys deploy, and how was that experience for you guys?
We went with the E3 plan, the Enterprise 3 plan for Office 365. So one of the main things we wanted to get out of it was redundancy. We had a tornado hit one of our branches here a couple years ago, so we wanted to bring in more redundancy to our email, and some of our infrastructure became a priority. So that was one of the reasons. Another reason we did it was to bring in the new Office apps and some new products for our people. So we first thing we did was basically roll out the new Office 2016 apps to everyone, got everybody there, gave them some introduction to that, and then we proceeded to replace our meeting program with Skype for business. Also introduced instant messaging. We hadn't had that before.
Okay.
And then the next product we rolled out was our intranet. We replaced our current intranet, which was kind of old and disused, with a new one. so that we could get more interaction bank-wide between all of our branches.
Okay.
So we did that first, and then for the most part, it went fairly smooth. We had a business partner help us do it, so that was good.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it's mostly a smooth process.
So you guys were using kind of the standard Office applications prior to that, so that was a fairly seamless or simple transition. Skype for Business, that was new to you guys. That was a new added functionality that you guys weren't previously using. And then as far as the intranet, I assume that's now on SharePoint Online. What were you guys using prior to that? Was that
it was just some third-party software. I don't know if the company even still exists. So before we used like 2007, 2010, 2013 kind of mix across the company. It really wasn't standardized. So we started back in 2016.
Okay.
And then, yep.
That makes a lot of sense. And so, tell us, kind of recapping your experience, like, is your deployment now basically what you guys were expecting kind of prior to it, or are there things that kind of surprised you about how Office 365 worked now that you have it in production compared to what you guys thought it was going to be like prior to that?
For the most part, I would say yes. We had a decent idea. Before we even tried to do it ourselves, we set up a few test businesses, for lack of a better word, and just test out the basic functionality, setting up some things. There were some things we couldn't do, obviously, because we didn't want to set up our Active Directory and stuff like that. But but yeah, for the most part, the Office programs, they stay roughly the same, between editions. So that was too bad for users to experience. The biggest hurdle was just kind of getting your head around how everything is interconnected because we run a hybrid environment. So we have our Active Directory in-house, and then we use AD Active Connect to connect to the cloud.
Gotcha.
And sync that. So we just had to kind of get our heads around how to do that. And once we got that done, we were good. It's just keeping in mind that all the administrative things don't go away; they just change.
Mm-hmm. Dave, what about you? What do you feel like are some of the biggest misconceptions between what organizations expect from Office 365 and what the actual experience is like once it's been deployed?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think Brad kind of hit on a couple of things, and it sounds like they were pretty keen to kind of what the realism was. And what we often see at the enterprise level is just a lack of awareness of what it really takes to manage and support an Office 365 deployment. And the way I kind of like to describe it is in simple terms. Microsoft brings the data center, they bring the infrastructure layer, the OS, and they provide that rudimentary patching and service packs or updates on the application layer and keep the lights on. They do a great job of that. But all the day-to-day stuff that used to happen from an end-user support perspective, from a move, add, change perspective, managing PowerShells, things like that. All that stuff still needs to happen, and something interesting Brad mentioned is they mentioned that they were hybrid, and even an AD hybrid type of scenario where you have AD on-prem, you have to deploy on-premise components, as you mentioned, things like ADFS if you want full single sign-on, and AD Connect for synchronization, and then as soon as you do that, you actually have to have on-prem administration, instances to push changes to Exchange, etc. up in 365. So what the organization is seeing is that it actually often takes more effort to kind of manage that day-to-day operations and support than it takes, than it used to take on-prem, and then add to that the end user experience and how to kind of make sure that you address that when that you now have multiple interfaces and potentially multiple instances to manage those end users. So there's a lot of realism there, and I think the big shock, and I was talking to earlier this fall, talking to a major institution in Australia, head of operations about their Office 365 deployment. His comment was, "Yeah, we're just kind of waiting for the keys from our project department to manage this thing." And we said, "Well, have you thought about actually how you're going to manage it and what needs to be in place and your level 1 help desk, how they're going to address users on different platforms?" And it was an interesting and almost enlightening conversation where he's like, "No, I didn't really think of that yet, and we kind of thought it ran itself." And that's not the case, so I think that's the biggest shocker.
And Phil, as far as it seems like Brad's, deployment and his migration from his on-premises into Office 365 went more or less as is expected. But what recommendations can you guys provide as far as assessing your environment and making sure that you're as prepared for a potential migration as possible?
There's several things, Justin, that are really important. In the planning phase, you need to do an assessment and architectural design to prepare for the deployment. You might also be just trying to figure out how you're going to take advantage of it. So there might be some ROI planning. There may be third-party system integration. You might have to integrate fax machines or other devices in the environment. You might have gateways. So there's some site preparation. You need to look at the network, make sure it's going to be all right. If there are multiple sites, you might have site surveys and the design for each site. If you have coexisting Active Directory that works with AD Sync or with Microsoft Identity Management servers, you have to plan and identify how that's going to work together. You might have, and then you have to do the actual migration. So there are things like migration tools and those kind of things that you have to make sure that you have available. And then while you're doing it and while you're getting ready to do it, there's adoption management and training. You have to do hypercare where you're actually working with the end users at the time that you're doing it. And that can be a really, really large operation, or it can be a small operation like Brad's. So if you have tens of thousands of users, then you have to schedule all of that. You might actually have to do internal marketing out to your client, to your client base, so that you're actually talking to them, and then the training around how to use the new applications. So there's quite a bit of those kind of things, and then decommissioning the old sites. So there's a lot to do before you even begin to manage it.
Brad, what did you guys do as far as end user training and adoption?
We were fortunate since we only have 130 users throughout our bank. It's kind of it's a family kind of feel. It's a family-owned bank. So each of our branches, we only have 10 to 15 employees. So we benefit from the fact that we don't have to deal with the scale of 10,000 users. So what we did is once we got the new products on their computers, we went to each branch and then we kind of did a sit down with them, everybody who could attend, and just introduced them to the new products, introduced them to how things work now as far as backing up their content, new features like secure email for everyone. Before we kind of had to limit it to certain users and they had to send out secure email to customers. Now everyone has the ability to. And Skype and SharePoint as well. We would just do sit-downs with the people and kind of just explain, not necessarily one-on-one, but face-to-face and stuff like that. We found that would be the best way. If we were a large organization, I don't know how we would have necessarily done it just because of the scale. But
well, hopefully, we would have had more help. But
yeah, probably would have had more help, for sure.
And now, Dave, one of the things that you had mentioned as far as expectations versus reality is, like you mentioned, the servers aren't there, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you necessarily have that much less work to do. How can you go into a little bit more detail about how the experiences compare? What burdens are lifted off of IT pros when you move to Office 365, and what are some kind of new skill sets or new learning curves that they may need to expect?
I think you can look at it different layers, right? So yeah, again, Microsoft kind of brings let's call it the underlying infrastructure and application management layer. But the other stuff that was there before still needs to happen. But again, now you have multiple instances. Plus, you have to have new expertise around ADFS and AD Connect and those components. And then you get into the challenge of the level 1 help desk, and they get a user that calls, and what platform is that user on, and where do we triage that to? And again, back to the comment where users nowadays are less tolerant in waiting for help and are expecting the level 1 help desk to actually be able to resolve things on the spot. How do we actually to bring that to the user? So it's kind of interesting, if a term that we get a lot nowadays is the term transformation, and organizations talk about moving to 365 and doing that as a sort of a transformational move, for the enterprise. And kind of the way I look at it is, moving Exchange and Skype for Business to 365, might be an IT transformation, but it doesn't necessarily offer transformation to your business or to your end users. And the key that we're, I guess the big question we're getting asked by organizations is, how do I bring that transformation to my end users around that support experience? How do I bring that transformation to my business units around, taking advantage of all the workloads they should have access to? We bought an E3 license with these different workloads available. How do I make it easy for them to consume? Another term we get asked or hear a lot about is shift left, and how do I move resolution and support close to my end user, self-service and delegated administration, things like that, versus what organizations are typically come upon is that actually administering in a standard kind of 365 deployment, it brings more of those complexities and brings a bit of a more difficult end user experience unless it's handled properly.
Okay, Phil, let's go back to you next. Brad was mentioning that he was using Azure AD. Can you back us up a little bit and talk about the different options as far as authenticating with Active Directory in Office 365? What are the options available, and when should organizations go with one over the other?
So that's a great question, Justin, and it really depends on doing that initial assessment architectural design. What does the customer have today? Because one of the misconceptions is that all your Active Directory and everything goes with Office 365, but it usually does not. So you have an Active Directory on site, you have to maintain that Active Directory. You may need Exchange servers just for the sync and transfer of data back and forth to Office 365. And so you will be using Azure AD with Office 365, but you may be using AD Sync, and I'm sure that Brad's team is, to sync the information locally with their local AD. And you might be using Microsoft Identity Management Server or some of those things. There may be any number of ways that you might do that. In addition to that, you might have on-site third-party integration. So you may be setting up all your users with your HR system, and that's interfacing with Active Directory. So it's really important to understand what the existing architecture is before you just start moving everybody to Active Directory. Mm-hmm. In addition to that, there are things like regulatory requirements and regulatory administration that has to be done. Maybe you're a HIP organization and you have to have a longer set of logs. I know Dave will talk about that in a minute, but you may have to keep logs longer than the standard 30 days that Office 365 keeps them, so you might have to have a way to do that. So that integration of Active Directory can happen in a number of ways, and it really is dependent on each customer to understand what their existing needs are to make sure those get transferred to Office 365.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And that brings up a good point. Brad, you guys work for a bank. I know a lot of organizations that are under heavy regulation have a lot of concerns still about moving to a cloud-hosted solution. Was that an issue for you guys when you were considering moving to Office 365?
Yeah, we wanted to make sure we had all our ducks in a row. I know my coworker, he came from a HIPAA environment, so he had an idea of HIPAA standards. I think ours are a little bit less, I should say, than theirs, but we also ran it by all of our auditors. We get audited by the OCC, so we ran it by them. What's the issues here, and security was the biggest one, obviously. We also talked to other bank CIOs, see what they thought, see if they were on it. There were plenty of banks that were. But then we also wanted to be able to do other things as far as reports to give auditors. We had to set those up. We also want to be able to retain emails, that kind of stuff, in case of client disputes or even internal HR disputes, that kind of stuff. So there was a lot of different reports and retention policies that we set up when we switched. That's just because we wanted to make sure we had all our ducks in a row in case somebody came knocking. So.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Either Dave or Phil, can you guys speak more to how you guys have worked with financial industries or any other heavily regulated industries and what they need to know about kind of what Brad's talking about as far as discovery and retention of information in Office 365?
Yeah, so Office 365 has some reasonable tools, but as the organizations get larger, the need for legal discovery and the need for legal hold and those kind of things becomes deeper. And the addition of third-party software might be something that you really want to consider. because you may want to have a way to have a redundancy of Office 365 so that you don't go down, and so that that information can be searched, and that you can do advanced searches on that information. And that kind of information, as well as the ability to be secure, the ability to filter the email before it actually gets to you so that you don't ever see it go into Office 365 or into the environment. Those are the kind of things that are part of that planning process too. So you really need to understand what your legal holds are, what your retention policies are, and those policies might be internal or they might be regulatory. So that also is part of the initial assessment and planning process, so that you make sure that as you go live, as Dave said, from the first user, those policies have to be in place. And you probably have reporting. You probably have reporting around all those, and you have to understand how you're going to report that and how that retention is documented.
Dave, I wanted to ask you, one of the other things you were talking about is, for hybrid deployments, which is something that I know a lot of folks do. What are you guys seeing? I mean, we've kind of talked about, on-prem AD versus Azure AD, but are there other reasons why you would still need to retain on-premise hardware if you're using Office 365? Like, I've heard that Exchange is one reason. Like, it's always good to have an on-premise Exchange server, even if you're using Exchange online. Anything that you can tell us as far as why that might be?
Well, so I mean, I think first off, most organizations are keeping their own AD, whether it actually be hosted, within their own data center or hosted up, in the cloud in Azure AD, or sorry, in Azure. They're keeping their own AD, and then most organizations, again, especially enterprise, are at least doing same sign-on, and as you move up in the enterprise spectrum, the end user is looking for single sign-on. As soon as you get into those paradigms, I mean, Brad mentioned it, you have to have things like AAD Connect and ADFS installed, and then as soon as you do that, your AD, whether it's on-prem or up and hosted somewhere else, right, essentially within your domain, it becomes the authoritative source, for the overall solution. And you actually have to have Tick Exchange, for example. You actually have to have an on-prem or within your domain Exchange server deployed to be able to push changes up into 365, because a lot of the functions in the 365 admin console end up becoming disabled. So that's one of the challenges we see there for sure. So.
And one the last things I wanted to talk about prior to going to some questions from the audience, Brad, you guys had mentioned that you guys brought in a partner to help you with the assessment and the migration. Can you talk about some of the reasons or the drivers behind going with a partner versus branching out on your own?
Yeah, I mean, none of us in our IT department have any experience pushing things to the cloud, especially something as core and as important as email, for one. So we wanted to make sure you do it right the first time. You don't break it and then have to go back. But besides the obvious fact, just to help in general, third-party vendor like we use, they bring things to your attention that you just don't think of. I mean, we spent months kind of just trying to wrap our heads around every single thing that could be affected by a move or go wrong. But even then, once we started really getting in depth with our partner to migrate to Office 365, that they brought up kind of other points that it just we didn't think of. So it's important to have somebody else have some other eyes and ears look at it too, and people who do it for a living, they've seen it all. So it just helps to have that kind of input.
Okay. And Phil, what about you guys? When do you guys recommend, I mean, obviously you guys provide migration services, but when does it make sense to bring in a partner to facilitate with that process?
I think it makes sense right away when you're going to go to Office 365, or even if you have to make a decision about Office 365, it makes sense to get a partner involved, because they can actually help you pay for the engagement through ROI planning and the things that go along with that. So it's really key to get started from the beginning, and that way all of the things that you might not have thought of really make sense, because sharing with you, for instance, that you might need multiple CAS servers to be able to throttle the migration as you move mailboxes up in a very large environment. You may not know that by yourself, and you probably won't know everything about all the gotchas. So if you get a qualified partner to assist you, it really is a help to you, and it reduces the time to service and the pain as you go through the process of migration and then management.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And Dave, as far as something like managed services for Office 365, when do you guys feel like something like that makes sense for organizations?
Well, I think one of the big things that we're seeing in the industry at the enterprise level is a move towards insourcing the core business applications, but outsourcing the non-core business applications. And I think I think we all agree that Exchange or email nowadays is a priority application, but it's not necessarily core business. So we see that regardless of 365. And then, again, as the complexities rise with these hybrid deployments and it gets more difficult to retain resources, it's almost not even a question. It's almost inevitable that organizations are looking for that help. And from our perspective, help comes in a matter of a few forms. And obviously, like you said, we're in the industry. We provide it, and we have the plethora of end-to-end managed services. We also have software technology to address a lot of things that I mentioned earlier. So yeah, it depends, but we're seeing it more and more common amongst the enterprise level.
Mm-hmm. Okay, very cool. Well, let's go ahead and get to some questions. Once again, guys, if you guys have questions for us, make sure you get them into that Q&A widget. But we'll start off with Brian9095, and his question is there a server piece required to use Skype as your phone system? Actually, this used to be the case back when I was doing Office 365 deployments, that you needed that on-premise link server, as we used to call it, in order to do voice over IP. Dave or Phil, do you guys know if that's still, or Brad, do you guys know if that's still the case? Do you still require an on-premise server for voice over IP with Skype?
So that depends. It depends on the environment, but you likely will need some kind of on-premise device in order to use Skype for Business online, because most of the deployments today are hybrid. But if you were purely voice in the cloud, it's possible to move completely off-prem. It's not like a link deployment.
Okay. Okay. All right, Brad, are you guys using Skype for voice over IP as well, or just for chatting?
No, we don't use it as a phone system.
Okay, all right, cool.
But Justin, just to that point,
yeah.
Skype for Business Enterprise Voice is supported to a certain extent in Skype Online and in some countries, but you're likely you need a partner even more if you're going to an enterprise voice environment than you do if you're just moving to an Exchange environment.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. I've got a question. We're getting a lot of questions about migrating from Google to Office 365. This one comes from Shelby. Either Dave or Phil, do you guys have any experience migrating from Google Apps and Google Business to Office 365, and what have you seen as far as that?
So we do, and that migration can be very simple or it can be a little bit tricky. So the mail piece is move the users to Office 365 and may or may not move the mail depending on how it's stored and how you're using it and what mail you're using, because you might not be using the Google tool itself. And then the apps are completely dependent on what kind of apps they are, and if the apps have to be recoded to be working on SharePoint or whatever it might be. So that migration is it's not straightforward. But it could be, depending on how simple it is and how simple the implementation is. So it really is dependent on the complexity of and how deeply you are ingrained in Google.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And Alex wants to know, are the calendars from Gmail able to transfer over to Office 365?
So there are ways to do it, but not seamlessly.
Okay. Good to know. All right. I've got a couple of questions actually for Brad. Someone wants to know, are you guys using Azure AD Connect in a hybrid environment, or is it entirely up in the cloud?
It's hybrid. Our AD is on premise here.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And then prior to moving to Exchange Online, did you guys have on-premise Exchange, and was it centralized at a company HQ? Like, do you have remote locations connecting to a local headquartered on-premise Exchange?
That's exactly what it was. We were running Exchange 2010 in our central data center, and then all of our branches would just connect to it. Yep.
Okay. All right. I've got a question from Double D. What's up, Double D? And he's asking, how is the experience for using Office 365 without a Microsoft account? And this is one that I've seen before. If you are trying to, for example, share SharePoint documents with organizations that don't have Microsoft accounts, is that something that's available that they can do now? Either Phil or Dave, do you guys know the answer to that?
So you can share documents with people that are not part of the Office 365 environment by sharing a link to the document itself that they only have access to as a guest. So, yes.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Brad, is that something that you guys do? Do you guys have external people utilizing your own Office 365, either SharePoint or any other application?
I guess to a degree, because we use the secure email function, we have, like, our loan processing uses it to send out documents, titles, that kind of things. And we had it set up when we originally did it as either make a Microsoft account or use a one-time token. And I don't, I guess, know why exactly, but the one-time token really caused us issues as far as people getting how to use it. So we had to do some extra training there, but and provide some documents to our customers just to kind of, hey, this is how you use one-time token if you don't want to create a Microsoft account. We encouraged creating a Microsoft account just because it helps speed up the process if you're regularly receiving them, like a company receiving titles, that kind of thing. But yeah, that's our biggest use of external.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I think
there are third-party tools that actually work with Office 365 seamlessly to allow you to have that sharing capability that makes tools simpler too if you want to.
Yeah, and there's different workloads. That's another good example. It makes it quite seamless. So.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And kind of along those lines, let's see here. Last Good Night was asking if you guys recommend just rolling with the built-in spam filters and backup of Office 365, or are there third-party solutions for spam and backup that you guys recommend?
Bill, you
there
want to
are
go first?
third-party tools. Yeah, there are third-party tools, and we typically recommend the third-party tools, and they are, tools like Mimecast or Proofpoint or a number of different vendors that allow you to do spam filtering, allow you to do backup, and also allow you to do archiving at a much deeper level. And we do recommend that for people that have the need for high security. Most people have a real security need around Office 365.
When we get into highly compliance-driven type of scenarios, banks and healthcare, et cetera, there's often the ask about backup and retention and multiple copies and so forth. And 365 obviously have multiple copies; they have backup, but most of them are looking for off-site kind of redundancy. So it often requires an outside application to do that.
But there are cloud-based vendors that do that, so you don't have to have things on-prem to make that happen.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Absolutely.
We're also getting a couple of questions about basically internet connectivity requirements. Mike wants to know if he has a slow and flaky internet connection, basically what elements of Office 365, if at all, would his organization be able to use?
So
you don't. Go ahead, Dave, if you want to.
Oh, I was just saying, for us, we have a 20 meg circuit out to the internet, and then we have all of our 10 branches pipe back into us. So it's kind of like they all pipe back in, and then we go out from our data center.
Okay, so you relay into your headquarters and then up to Office 365. Okay.
Yep, exactly. And we haven't had any issues with the 20 meg for 10 branches using it. As far as email being slow or not working, or Skype not working, or the meetings being sluggish or just not good. We haven't had any issues at all as far as that from our personal experience.
Okay. Dave, were you going to say something?
No. Thanks, Brad, for covering that.
Okay. All right. I've got a question from John who's asking, how does Office 365 work with a workstation that has multiple users on one workstation? Do you log into the Office application on each account on that machine, or just one login and it registers for the whole machine no matter who logs in? It's a good question.
From what we saw, because we have tellers, so obviously tellers float around their machines. You can have up to 5 people on one machine. The first machine you installed it on, it'll ask you to sign in. You sign in as that user. It'll activate the machine for that user, and then the rest of the users can use it, but it doesn't account against their total, from what we've seen. But you also have to keep in mind if that employee is terminated, then the machine will get deactivated, and then you have to sign in to somebody else.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, that's what we saw.
Dave or Phil, anything to add?
I think it's
so it's possible to.
Go ahead, Phil.
So it's possible to set up a kiosk kind of machine where the user's profile follows them, and so when they use the machine, so that they're using their instance of the machine. But you're not going to be able to have an unlimited number of machines that you log into. But Office 365 does allow multiple copies and multiple logins. So if you're using multiple machines because your job requires that, then there's an allowance for that in Office 365.
And it helps that our organization is small enough yet where we don't have really the possibility of one user having to use that many machines where they run into the limit. If you're bigger, it could already be a problem.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I've got an interesting question from Chuck Layton, and he's asking, can we purchase Exchange Online without using Office 365? I mean, Exchange Online is part of Office 365, but I believe there was an Exchange-only license. Is that correct or no?
Yeah, so you can
online. You can buy Exchange as a separate server.
Mm-hmm.
But it will be a license for Exchange Online if you're trying to get it in the cloud.
Mm-hmm.
But you can buy the workload separately.
Yeah, and the desktop applications as well. So you can still use your your desktop Outlook application for Exchange Online.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. Let's go. This question is from Mark. I'm sorry, it's from Mark, and I think it's to Brad. And he's asking, what was the most challenging problem that you had to overcome? Was there a feature that users were excited to get that they didn't have before?
It's a challenging problem. Honestly, it wasn't necessarily with Office 365, but before I arrived, and I guess the whole IT staff, because we've all arrived for the past 2 years, but there wasn't a lot of standardization. As far as usernames and all this kind of stuff. And it caused a bunch of problems later on as far as when we tried to implement SharePoint and stuff like that. People got confused about what they're supposed to be entering because it's not, they would say, like when they logged into Microsoft products online, it would say under your email address, but it wasn't their email address, it was their username at our midwestbank.com. And a lot of people didn't understand that. So it caused a bunch of problems. So we had to standardize usernames, email addresses, the whole lot. That was the biggest issue. Was just making sure everything was standardized, so that there wouldn't be confusion later on, and people wouldn't understand how to log into the products, and then they wouldn't stop. They'd stop using them, like Skype or SharePoint. As far as the thing that people are most excited about, I would probably say Skype. Just because, like I said, we didn't have instant messaging before. Some people were excited about that. Some people didn't care. But another thing I allowed them to do was the meetings and sharing their desktop. A lot of people, once we told them that, hey, you could either start a Skype meeting or give somebody a call and then share your desktop through Skype to do training or something like that, they got really excited because we have remote branches. We don't have a head of everything at every branch. So, you'd have to do training with the head of, let's just say, tellers, that kind of thing. They could do a remote session, share their screen, and then just be like, okay, I'll watch you do this process. And then as the user was doing the process, they could be like, oh, that's where you went wrong. Instead of just trying to guess over the phone or just leaving them out in the cold and letting them figure out themselves. So.
Either Dave or Phil, anything to add as far as what you guys have seen as really popular user features?
Well, there's a couple things. The first gotcha and the biggest gotcha is usually Active Directory remediation. So the kind of thing that you were talking about is just the tip of the iceberg, Brad. But features that are used. We see Skype adoption being probably one of the biggest things that people use a lot of, and then document sharing in SharePoint is also very big, taking over and having OneDrive. OneDrive is a very popular feature.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting when you start looking at the feature or workload set that's available in 365. There's stuff that people didn't think about. There's very interesting presentation applications where you can easily make interactive, PowerPoint presentations, tracking user views and timings and so forth. There's a lot of stuff that people don't even kind of think about in the difference in licensing sets in 365 that are very cool. I mean, OneDrive's simple and awesome. Yammer, again, I see that getting adopted a lot more even at the enterprise level. So,
Are you guys seeing a lot of adoption? Delve and Yammer?
Right. What we're seeing people as they get Office 365 really begin to use both, and the whole ability to do collaborative document creation that they started to touch on. Multiple people working on the same document in different places is becoming very popular with our clients.
Cool. All right, I've got a question. A couple of people are asking this, including Barbara and Rich, and I'm guessing this has to do with compliance reasons, but they're asking if you can specify that your data can only, in Office 365, only reside in U.S. data centers. Do you guys know if that's possible? Like not get replicated to overseas or anything like that?
So I'll take the first hit at that, and Phil can correct me if I'm wrong. But I mean essentially, Microsoft and Office 365 sort of divide themselves up into regions, North America, South America, etc. For North America and for the U.S., there's kind of three things that we see out there. One of them is it's called the multi-tenant 365 that we're all used to. There's another one for ITAR that's targeted obviously towards specific industries, government, military, etc. And ITAR is the U.S. compliant ITAR. And then there's the odd instance of dedicated Office 365 that we see out there, which we're seeing more and more move away from dedicated into the next 365 deployment model. So you can't necessarily specify where, but those are the kind of the options that are available to you as far as deployment perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'd add a couple things. So, as a CSP provider, and as which is a cloud service provider, it's important to understand that Microsoft also has a group of partners like Dimension Data that do private cloud offerings of the Office 365 suite. So, if you have data sovereignty issues, if you have third-party integration that you need, let's say Skype, for instance, things that you can't do in Office 365. Then you may need to talk with a vendor about the private cloud offering and being able to take advantage of your cloud eSKU in that manner, because that's very, very possible. And there are certain levels of regulation where a shared instance that might be replicated somewhere else can't be used, and you need a private cloud version, or where Microsoft doesn't do Office 365 dedicated anymore. And you also might want to be taking advantage of third-party video and conferencing and things. So you might have a company like Polycom that you're using, and they work very, very well with Office 365. But then you might have some off-site needs or some needs in other countries where you need to integrate services from a company like that. And it's really important that we take a look at that with the client to help them understand, how can you take advantage of this and still be within regulatory compliance? How can you take advantage of equipment that you already bought or assets that you already have and still use your eSKU from Microsoft?
Okay. All right. I've got a question from IT Jargon. Actually, this one's coming up a lot as well. What's the gap now between Office 365 apps and the on-premises version? Are there features that are still available on-prem that aren't available on Office 365?
There are a few, not many. Most of the Office 365 apps are very robust. If you're doing custom development and you have custom tools and things that you're using in SharePoint on-prem, there may be some things that don't work. You'll need to certify them against the SharePoint instance in the cloud. If you have the need to have access to private data that you can't share to the cloud, those are going to cause issues of restriction. If you're trying to do enterprise voice with Skype Enterprise Voice, and you have analog devices and some other things that you need to take care of, or you're crossing borders and those kind of things, then how you use Skype PBX in the cloud can be limited, so you may have to have an on-prem version, and you may need to have a vendor that can handle, or you may need to handle all three. You might have to have a on-prem instance, or because your environment's so big, you might have an on-prem instance, you might have a hosted or private cloud instance, and you might have a Office 365 instance. And so you'll need to think about how you would integrate the three together. And usually that takes a third-party tool or a third party to assist with that.
Brad, did you guys notice anything when you transitioned over, any loss of functionality or anything that you guys noticed that you were missing?
No, not really, just because you know, some of the new features we were using we hadn't used before. And then for email and stuff like that, it does everything we had before and more. The only thing we did notice that Phil kind of spoke to is when we were setting up our intranet, there are a few things that we would have liked to have done through coding, but we couldn't do just because SharePoint Online wouldn't give us the flexibility to do it.
Mm-hmm.
But other than that, we really haven't had many limitations, no.
Okay. Phil, you kind of touched on this earlier, but wanted to know a little bit more. Thomas wanted to know if you can use an on-premises spam appliance like Barracuda with Office 365.
So Barracuda, a lot of third-party vendors, F5 and others, are used in front of Office 365 and can be used. You may want to accelerate the data. You may have limited bandwidth. You may want to have an interface. Probably will want to have an interface on the client side to make sure that everything is controlled and secure. So yes, absolutely, third-party tools like Barracuda could be used on a regular basis.
And what about cloud, for example, like CASB, like Cloud Access Security Brokers, that provide additional improved auditing and reporting? Have you guys worked with any of those?
We have. We work with many of them. One example might be Mimecast. Mimecast does all of the spam filtering, all of the archiving, all of the backup of the data, and redundancy. So if an Office 365 instance goes down for some reason, then you still would have email. You wouldn't go down. You go into coexistence mode, or continuity mode, as it's called. So that's one example. But yeah, there are vendors that specialize in the ability to have continuity and security in all of the flavors that are needed in front of Office 365, and they are cloud offerings.
All right, let's try to get to a few more. Dave, this question is for you. Carla said that she was coming in right at the end as you were talking about the managing Exchange through the Office 365 and mid-console being somewhat limited. Can you kind of go over that and explain that again?
Yeah, sure, no worries. So what we were saying is you know, what we see very common in the enterprise space, and you know, Brad kind of echoed the same thing, is you know, an on-prem or a dedicated AD where they've got AD Connect and potentially ADFS deployed to tie it into 365 Azure AD. And as soon as you end up doing that, your AD ends up being the authoritative in the whole scenario. And the Exchange, or sorry, the Office 365 admin server can't run a lot of the functions to push administrative changes up into 365 because of that. And it's kind of interesting. You go to actually run the function, it'll get right to the very end, and it'll give you a pretty detailed message saying, no, your AD is the authority. You have to run this from your on-prem admin server. So we see that need to deploy, for example, the Exchange admin server on-prem or within the domain to actually push those changes. You know, another question I think that came up, and I'll kind of answer it in the same breath, is around running PowerShell on-prem. Yeah. So that's where that scenario comes in, is where you absolutely can run PowerShell on-prem for the commands that are available in the 365 kind of command library, commandlets as well through that. Yeah.
Okay, and we'll go ahead and take. Well, we're getting a couple of questions about uptime and maintenance windows. Maybe Brad, we'll have you speak to that. I mean, obviously, as a financial services, uptime is really important to you guys. What's been your experience so far, and kind of what was it that Microsoft, whoever kind of talked to you about this beforehand, kind of ensured you about uptime to make you feel comfortable with hosting stuff in the cloud?
You know, as far as uptime is concerned, we haven't had any downtime. The only time that we've had any issues is when our circuits go down, which isn't very often. But as far as Microsoft's end, they've held up their end of the bargain pretty much. There's a nice little feed once you log into the Office 365 admin that kind of shows you any issues that Microsoft is having. They let you know immediately what's there. They also kind of point out to you if it's going to affect you or not, that kind of stuff. Usually they're just, if there's problems there, they're minor things that affect a couple customers. And like I said, we haven't had any issues it's like, okay, Microsoft's on the fritz or anything like that.
But as far as like kind of making the decision to go to Office 365, did you guys receive assurances about uptime, or kind of what were the promises that they made?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the third-party vendor we went with, they told us their experiences with it. They said that they hadn't had any like long-term or issues, that basically they kept happening over and over again. We also, you know, vetted people in our industry, different CIOs, that kind of stuff. Hey, you know, do you have Office 365? What's your experience with it? Did you have downtime? Did you have security issues? That kind of stuff. So we talked to a number of people in our own industry as well as others just to see how their experience was with it, were they comfortable with it, would they do it again, that kind of stuff. So yeah, we talked around to vendors and people in our community industry, that kind of stuff too.
Okay, we'll take one more question. This one comes from Adaya. Maybe Dave will have you start with it. Is there a functionality difference between Azure AD Connect with AD on-premise or going fully cloud-hosted?
Sorry. So the question is there a difference between going, you know, fully, let's call it, homogeneous to the cloud, versus still retaining your own on-prem AD?
Right.
Well, I mean, it certainly, it all depends on what your overall scenario is, right? If you have, you know, other applications that depend on your AD, you want to have single sign-on, and retain that kind of seamless end-user experience. From that perspective, then you're going to need to retain that on-prem AD. We actually see very few. I don't think I've seen one enterprise organization. And when I say enterprise, I mean small organizations, obviously a little more flexible that way. But I don't think I've seen one enterprise organization yet go homogeneous to the cloud. They may look at moving all of their workloads as much as possible there. Often, you know, you still have to have, for whatever reasons, compliance, confidentiality, whatever, still have to have some on-prem workload footprint, some emails, you know, users remaining on-prem, or like Phil said, when you get into the voice side of things and some of the requirements there's some, you know, there's often on-prem requirements.
All right, very cool. Well, we're nearing the end of the show. I'm running out of time, so I wanted to give you guys one last opportunity to share any final thoughts or advice that you might have. Brad, for folks that either are planning an Office 365 migration or are currently deploying it, or currently have a deployment, and want to make sure that it's as successful as it can be, do you have any advice for them?
I guess if you're planning to go to Office 365, you just take your time with it. And try to get your head around everything that's tied into what you're migrating to, whether it be email or SharePoint or Skype, that kind of stuff. Talk to people, talk to vendors who help you, talk to people in the Spiceworks community or people in your industry, see what they like, see what they ran into that they didn't expect, that kind of stuff. You know, and then just evaluate it on a cost basis. That's what we did when we first went. Because we had gotten requests from users for things like Skype and SharePoint, and so we just did a cost of running it on-prem versus running it in the cloud, and the maintenance and paying more for licenses, that kind of stuff, and updating every 3 years and that kind of thing. And the cost-benefit analysis came out that it was better for us to go to the cloud than it was to buy on-prem and all that kind of stuff. So just take your time and evaluate the cost and the security and all that, and see how it works best for your organization.
Okay, very cool. Phil, we'll go to you next. Any final takeaways that you'd like the folks watching today to go home with?
Yeah, don't be afraid. Go ahead and make the move. It's going to be a move that saves you over the long run. You'll never have to do this major migration again. Take your time, do it right, plan it, engage someone that works with you. You know, if you have a big investment in a vendor like Polycom, the phones are still going to work with Skype for Business in the cloud. You don't have to be afraid of going ahead and moving. You're going to get the functionality. You may need to plan around that functionality to make sure you get everything you have today, but you can do it. can do it today. So go forward and grab a partner to help you.
Sounds good. All right, and it looks like we lost Dave, so maybe we'll give him a couple more minutes to come back. But in the meantime, I did want to thank everyone for hanging out with us today. Got a lot of really good questions, so big thanks for all that. It is time to announce the winner of our prize, and so the winner of the Arctic 45 cooler is going to go to Chris Jones, aka CJ Awesome. Congratulations, Chris. You are the winner. Send Emily a private message in the community. Let her know where you want that cooler shipped. It looks like we got Dave back just in time. Dave, we were just wrapping things up. Any final thoughts or takeaways that you'd like the folks that are watching today to go home with? Dave, are you there? Hello, Dave. We have lost him again. Dave, if you can hear us, we're still losing him. Well, thanks again, everybody, for hanging out with us today. Dave, one last shot, otherwise we got to cut it.
All right.
All right, we got to go. Well, thanks again to all the panelists, Brad, Phil, and Dave. Definitely had a really good time. We'd love to do this again with you guys sometime. But in the meantime, y'all make sure to check out all the upcoming events that we've got coming up by popping open that orange widget that has all the other events that you can find just like this one. But until next time, guys, stay safe and keep it spicy. Have a wonderful weekend, and we'll see you guys later. So long, everybody.
I'm back, guys. Thank you very much.
All right, bye, guys.
See ya.
Just in time.